It is scrap day, my dudes. Always a very exciting day for me. But this time, I hope that doesn't hit my car. This time, I figured we'd do things a little differently. Because it was mentioned to me that while there is no shortage of scrapping videos on YouTube, it might be fun to do a quick start, just the basics, how-to guide, for someone who's looking at getting into it or isn't really sure where to start. I know a lot of people who watch my channel already have plenty of experience scrapping, and if that's the case, well, this is not going to be anything you guys don't already know. But thanks for hanging out anyway. Let's do this thing. Now, in order to get started, you're going to need some tools, and I wouldn't suggest anything less than a magnet. A pair of wire cutters sometimes. I prefer these ones. They're a little bulky, and to be honest, tin snips like these are the wrong tool for the job. They are going to go dull if you use them to cut through wire all day. But when they're sharp, they make things go fast and smooth, so I still prefer them. You also need a quality pair of grips, and these ones are my personal pick. I know there's a ton of different ones on the market, but I like these because they've got a lot of grip, a really wide mouth if you need. They adjust quickly, and I didn't think I would use them as often as I did, but when I lost my first pair, I replaced them immediately. I like these ones. And a multi-head screwdriver. As a bare minimum, and as an upgrade, this is the way to go. Cordless, saves you a lot of effort and time. And be sure to bring it with the longest Phillips head you've got to maximize its usefulness. I had one, and I lost it. Because it was so useful, I had it with me all the time. Anyway, your magnet here is definitely the first and foremost because that helps you identify ferrous metals. Ferrous meaning containing iron, and that is the most common kind of metal you will find anywhere. You can find mountains of it rusting all over the place. Now, for any full-time serious scrapper, that rusty stuff is going to be the bread and butter. You're going to find it everywhere, and if you have a truck or a trailer, you could reliably expect to fill it up and get $40 to $100 a load, and you can probably do that twice a day if you just cruise picking up washers, dryers, stoves, microwaves, old computer cases, everything. That stuff will go in a shreddable tin, and the nice part about that is you don't need to worry about cleaning it up. Like, just go ahead, leave on all the stickers and the plastic garbage and the fasteners. It doesn't matter. They don't care. Same money. You might want to remove the goodies like the copper that's in a microwave or the stainless steel drum that'll be in a washing machine, but that's totally up to you if you want to spend your time doing it. You don't have to. I'm sure they'll be happy to pick it apart after you leave. Now, for me personally, this is all the space I've got, so I don't usually bother with that stuff. The most I've gotten out of a steel run in this was $40, and I was focusing on the densest pieces I could find. So I'm talking about heavy bars and bed frames, and I did have some computer cases and some microwaves, but I think it was Bearded Diver who suggested this to me. They were completely full of little bits of steel. So all the screws and little corners and just junk that was metal, I put them inside the cases, so these were very heavy little metal boxes. And $40 is decent, so there's really nothing wrong with that, but I certainly don't focus on steel so much because the pile gets pretty big pretty fast. That's kind of its value, though. One more tool that you might want to be sure to bring, it's a luxury item, but it's pretty nice, pair of gloves. Wouldn't be without it. That's just me. Now, the one piece of steel that I grab every time is these things. Now, I used to ignore them. Brake drums and brake rotors. They're cast iron, so the value is a little higher. Anywhere from $1 to $3 a piece. So that might not seem like much, but everybody just leaves them lying around, and it does not take long to build up a big pile of them. And when you find one, you'll usually find 2 or 4. So it's one of the easiest $5 to $10 you'll make. I wouldn't leave them lying around. Some other common places you'll find cast iron, which I don't have any examples right in front of me, are the grills from some barbecues. They gotta be the heavy, thick ones though, and old clawfoot bathtubs. Yeah, that's why they're so heavy. Most of them are not made out of porcelain, they're actually cast iron covered in... I don't know what they're covered in. Now, with the ferrous steel and tin out of the way, let's talk about the stuff that a magnet won't stick to. This is the stuff that I focus on because it takes up a lot less space. The next most common type of scrap you're going to come across, aluminum and wire. Let's start with insulated copper wire. That means it's got the plastic insulation still on. There's basically 3 categories. Insulated copper number 1, number 2, and number 3. They're graded based on the percentage of their total weight your scrapyard is going to get out of them in actual copper. Number 1 being the best, and that, a decent rule of thumb here is if you bend it and it holds that bend, it's probably some decent #1 solid core. Now, different scrapyards sometimes have a different interpretation of what exactly insulated #1 copper wire is, so best just to ask them to give you an example of the smallest stuff they'll accept as copper 1. Now, #2, that's your everyday stuff, the snickel fridge, the power cords, the little connective wires inside appliances, AC adapter, like all sorts of everything else. That's where that goes. Now, #3 is, of course, the lowest of the low. We're talking about Christmas lights, bulbs on, little plasticky bits stuck on, just low yield out of all of this. Now, I did a video a little while back where I experimented with different types of Christmas lights to see how much you increase your payout by the hour you spend chopping off all of the bulbs. And in short, if you're gonna do it, just do the ones with big bulbs. It seems a little counterintuitive, but those you'll get about $7 an hour if you work fast. And so if you've got a big pile of them and you got nothing going on, personally, I'm gonna bring them in just like this, because that is all the time I have in my life for Christmas lights. Now, the #2 stuff, the everything else, my yard wants it clean, like everything cut off, no connectors. I'm gonna have to find a pair of scissors and get this off, because that's not good enough for them. But they give me a good price and they let me pile pretty much anything I want into the #2 pile, as long as it's not coax. Nobody wants coaxial. Do not let it into your #2 pile, because your scrapyard will not be happy. That's the stuff that cable TV and old video game systems were connected. It looks like it's got a nice solid copper core, but that solid copper center running through it is actually a steel wire that's just copper coated. It's absolutely worthless. Don't even pick it up. Now, outside of those, there's a couple other types of wire your scrapyard might pay you more for if you keep them separate. The first one, Cat5. I'm talking about Ethernet cables. You're gonna need to cut the ends off of this, but the places that want it separate will give you a higher price for it. I think it's because it's got 5 small strands of very, I don't know why it is, but they pay a little more. The other one, this BX cable, that's, I believe, the proper name for it. It's got an aluminum casing on the outside, and the inside is this nice solid core kind of stuff. And that stuff adds up quick because it's heavy. Some places will pay more for this housing wire kind of stuff too. And these kinds of ones, that's a high copper content with an aluminum sheet, so they'll give you a totally different grade for that as well. There is one to watch out for, so keep an eye out or you might be tricked. See these? Yeah. It looks like a really nice thick piece of wire, but it's a little suspicious. 1, because it's super flexible, and 2, it really doesn't weigh very much. So if you take out your snips and have a look inside, see that silver sparkle on there? Yeah, this is aluminum wire with a copper coating. That's another thing your scrapyard doesn't want you sneaking into the #2 copper insulated bin. And honestly, unless you've got a lot of space, I would just put it back. Even these things here, they look like they got copper on them. That's copper coated steel. Also not worth anything. Into the shred if you've got a shred bin. Now, if you find a whole pile of aluminum wire at once, I wouldn't leave it lying around because it is worth money, but it takes a while to add up. So unless you've got more space than you know what to do with, or you somehow find it all the time, I wouldn't feel bad leaving it behind. That'll lead us nicely into the most common scrap metal, and actually the most common metal in the world, aluminum. Now, aluminum is fairly easy to identify because of 3 different reasons. The first is it's extremely light. The second is it's extremely flexible. And the third is it's almost whitish silver color. There's a lot more kinds than you might think, but for scrapping, it's primarily grouped into 3 different categories. First one we see here, this is old aluminum. It's really thin. It's probably been hammered or milled flat somehow. It's used on things like siding, baking trays, and pots and pans. In fact, pots and pans are a really common source of this stuff. Doesn't weigh very much, so it does take kind of a while to add up. But fill up a bin and you'll probably have 10 or 20 bucks worth. And it's super common. You will find it all over the place. So it doesn't take as long as you might think. Now the next one, and the easiest one to get excited about, aluminum extrusion. Or extruded aluminum. Try and ignore the plastic bits on these. Aluminum extrusion is a process in which they take a piece of aluminum stock and they heat it up and they force it through a shaped die so that it comes out the other side in the shape that they want. This somehow makes it stronger, and it's generally a much purer grade of aluminum, so it's worth a little more. You can tell primarily by looking at the shape, and if you see these machined edges like they've been cut down and there's no seams connecting things together, or they have little divots or shapes where things will stick onto them, that's aluminum extrusion. Most common sources of these will be fence posts. Here, I've got some pieces. Railings will be aluminum extrusion, and also something like this, extruded. Stuff's a lot denser, so it adds up a lot quicker, but you might mistake it for steel if it wasn't that it was non-magnetic and so easy to scratch. Now the other one is cast aluminum. You can tell it's cast because it's light and it's got a complicated shape. So you'll commonly find this on waffle irons, as well as barbecues, and something like this base of a saw. If you're not sure if it's cast, just hit it with a hammer. It's really brittle. Oh, another point about aluminum extrusion, there's actually quite a few different grades of this stuff. I went to one scrapyard and they wanted me to separate everything. There was like 4 different bins that they wanted it took forever. I don't take aluminum to that yard anymore because I honestly don't have time for that stuff. I go to one that just lets me throw all of the extrusion into one bin and gives me one price. It's great. There's one other kind of aluminum that's actually pretty common that you'll want. Yes, an aluminum rim. Can we just take a minute to appreciate how messed up this one is? That was not me, and I have no idea how he did that. Oop, I got a little water going on here. Aluminum rim is actually an alloy, so it's a different grade and a different price, but it's a good price, so grab them if you got them. Oh, and most radiators in cars are also made out of aluminum. All of the new ones are, and those are a different grade as well. Now, I find aluminum to be one of the most important scrap metals to clean, and I'm not talking about with a brush and soap and water. I mean removing any of the non-aluminum bits from it, because it's worth about 3 times as much this way. Something like this piece, I'm not really sure if I'm going to bother cleaning it or not, because it's just got a few of those. Now, scrapyards have a certain percentage of contaminants that are allowed in the bins that they sell to their buyers. So, if I have a big enough pile of aluminum, and that's just included in it, I might be able to talk them into just grading it along with the rest of the stuff. I think they told me 5%, which is actually kind of a lot. The only problem is aluminum is really light, so just a little bit of steel can put it over 5%. We'll find out. Either way, I'm not spending all day taking those off. Something like this, these rivets are aluminum, not sticking, but that plastic is going to ruin it. Now this PVC can be pretty resilient, but if I can break it off with a hammer, that'll save me a lot of time. That'll work. If it's really dirty, they'll call it aluminum breakage, which is not worth very much at all. But the thing is, aluminum breakage is something that has aluminum on it. I dove into a dumpster one time and I found these 2 really big aluminum frame windows that still had all of the wood that they were built on and around stuck onto them, and I didn't want to spend all day taking screws and nails and picking that thing apart, so I just threw them in my car and took them to the scrapyard the way they were. They didn't like them with the glass in there, so I smashed that out over a bucket. I still got 30 bucks for a quick run. So aluminum breakage isn't all bad. It's just, you just want to make sure it's heavy enough to make it worth it. Now, other less common things you should definitely keep an eye out for because they are worth a lot more than aluminum. Let's talk about copper and brass. Brass. That was really loud. You're not going to find copper very often because everybody's after it because everybody knows it's worth money. But it's easy to identify because of its color, it's copper, or it patinas green, and it smells like blood. It's also heavy and flexible. They use this stuff in piping because since it's so soft and flexible, it's easy to fuse together, but it also doesn't contaminate water with rust or anything like that. They've kind of switched to plastic for a lot of applications because it's gotten really expensive because it's so awesome. It's seriously an amazing metal. It doesn't rust, it's really malleable, it's got a really pretty color, and it's extremely conductive, so it's just incredibly useful for so many different things. It's common in microwaves and old tube TVs, but if you're going to scrap those, you're only going to get about $4 out of each of them, so honestly, I don't really do them anymore, but if you're going to, I would suggest stacking up a whole bunch of microwaves and doing it really fast. The old tube TVs, the good part is not what you might think. It's not the yoke, the really obvious copper part. It's the copper, it's the degaussing cable that runs around the actual glass on the inside. Now copper also has 3 different grades. There's number 2 copper, which means it's got contaminants like solder or paint on it. There's number 1 copper, which is like this one here. It's kind of dirty, but it doesn't have any contaminants on it. Or even this one, because it does have a green patina, but it's still, you know, a pure chunk. And then bare bright, which really shows the beauty of this stuff. And it has to be exactly what it sounds like. Bare and bright. The wire follows the same grade. This stuff, number 1. This stuff, bare bright. Now this stuff's pretty heavy, so you do want to put the time into separating your number 2 from your number 1. This solder, no good. But if you chop it off right here, then that whole length becomes number 1. And then the end that still has solder on it, you just throw it into the number 2. I have a little a pipe cutter. It's that tool that you lock on and then turn and turn and turn and turn. But honestly, that takes forever. The stuff is soft enough. You can probably, if you have a sharp enough axe, just chop through it with an axe on a chopping block. But more than likely, just hit it with something heavy till it's flat and bend it and bend it and bend it and it'll come right off. It's easy. The next one we better talk about is brass. You'll find it in all the same places that they would have used copper, but copper was too soft. So, things like this faucet head, all the fittings and threaded parts are brass, because copper would be too soft, but it's still got copper tubes on it. A lot of the time, the silver bits will be chrome or zinc-plated brass as well, but you're going to have to get that layer off before you can really tell. You might use a file, you might use a saw, but when I'm in the field, I just grind it on a piece of pavement, and oh look, see that golden yellow? Got ourselves a piece of brass. Now brass is another one of those ones that you really want to clean, meaning taking off all of the steel and plastic and whatever isn't brass, because it's worth about 3 times as much when you do. Stuff like this, unfortunately, can be really, really difficult to take apart. So a lot of the time, well, I just leave it in a pile, because it hurts my feelings bringing it in the way it is and getting almost no money for it, knowing that it's worth quite a bit more. Now for me, taking those things apart, a scroll saw would be a dream come true, because then you could just saw straight through the difficult threaded in parts and it would fall right apart. So if you have access to one of those, well, go you. It's also pretty common for door handles, but unless it was a big heavy piece like this, I find them too much of a pain to take apart. And you will want to do the magnet test on the hardware as well, because oftentimes those are brass. Other places you'll find brass, these plugs. They go in as dirty brass, but they do add up. And even the ones that don't look like they're brass, if you do a scrape test on them, you'll find that these are just coated with something to make them silver and more visually appealing. They're still brass. A lot of decorative housewares are brass or brass in disguise. Even this candle holder is in fact brass. That's actually why brass is one of my favorites. It's extremely common if you know where to look for it. And it's worth a lot. Because it's basically copper in disguise. It's an alloy of copper and nickel. I think it's nickel. So while copper is worth over $2 a pound, brass isn't far behind at about $1.50. But brass wins over copper in that where they use it, it's generally in big, heavy chunks. So that stuff adds up quick. Probably want to get good at finding and identifying brass. Like on car radiators, the way they used to make them. They used to be made out of big chunks of brass and copper. Those are money, if you can find one. You'll need to do a scratch test to identify them though, because generally something that old, they'll just look completely black on all the brass parts, and the copper will look like this really muddy green. But you'll be happy when you do find one, trust me, they're out there. Oh, speaking of big chunky things that add up fast, lead. You're gonna want to find you some lead. Yes, I'm talking about lead acid batteries. You can identify them pretty easily, because it'll say right on it, lead acid battery. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a battery made out of lead and acid. Something to do with the way electricity works. Go ask AVE, I don't know. You'll also find lead acid batteries in things like these portable chargers. Anything that needs to carry power with it and it's heavy, it's got a battery. Might be lead. You should check. But these things are really heavy. They add up quick and people throw them out all the time. So keep an eye out for them and check a few different scrapyards to find the best price. Because if anyone's giving you less than 30 cents, you're probably getting ripped off. That's Canadian. I don't know about you guys down in the States. Other sources of lead. A leaded glass window. It's not just a fancy name. This one's frozen to the floor, I'd show you, but it's a sheet of lead. They used to use those on roofs and doors, and it's a fireproofing kind of a thing. Lead is pretty easy to identify because it's really heavy, but it's also really, really soft. And of course, wheel weights. You know, the thing that they balance your tires with. And then the even rarer metals than those are actually more common than you might think. The platinum, silver, and gold. Yes, we're talking about e-waste. Now I gotta say, Canada is a little behind the ball on this one. People down in the States, you guys have way more places to bring them in. It seems like every scrapyard down there is accepting low, mid, and high grade circuit boards. So call around, because you might have someone local, and that would be a lot easier. You'll find that stuff all the time. I'm talking about computers, laptops, cell phones. Now, to be honest, I don't have a heck of a lot of experience with that stuff because I've never sold any of it. But Dumpster Marcus seems to be all over that game, and following his advice, I've been stacking up motherboards, RAM, Goldfinger cards, video cards and sound cards, and hard drives, and cell phones. So those are the ones I'm stacking in a bin, and someday I'll sell them. There's a guy that contacted me who's out in Ontario, and apparently he's buying them, and there might even be one in Vancouver now. I'm not sure. So even as a Canadian, save them. Somebody wants those. I'm going to do a video of that upcoming when I get around to it. Don't rush me. Now the other thing you're going to find when you're scrapping these electronics is more copper, but you choose your own adventure on that one. Things like these, electric motors. These things are also electric motors. So just throw those in a pile. Now while you're picking apart circuit boards, you're also going to find this kind of stuff. These are also copper bearing motors, but they are very small. Even these ones, which seem to have a high amount of copper on them, I've picked them apart before and like had all the copper floss that comes out of them. In my opinion, I wouldn't bother. Maybe if you had buckets and buckets of them and you had a hammer mill to throw them into, yeah, this one's up to you guys. Now there's a couple more exotic ones we got to talk about before this video is complete. Let's start with stainless steel. This one you'll actually find more often than you might think. Identifying it can be a bit of a headache, but your handy dandy magnet is your best bet here. It's not magnetic, but it's also a lot heavier than aluminum. Odds are it's stainless. And you can find that a lot of different places, like backsplashes or facings of appliances in kitchens. Or something like a water fountain, which has to be strong, but also not rust. It can be difficult to identify because sometimes even stainless is magnetic. That's because there's different grades of it, and I looked this up. I'm not an expert on this sort of stuff, but apparently it has more to do with the crystalline structure. I mean, if it was simply a matter of whether the stuff in it was magnetic, it would still be magnetic because it's still made out of steel. Now, apparently the surest way to determine whether it's stainless steel or just regular steel is the spark test. This means you take a grinder or something that'll make it spark, and the length and color of the sparks will tell you. Now, I don't have a big enough operation to have those tools hooked up and like do the spark test on things all the time. So for me, the most reliable way of identifying it, and this is actually true of a lot of metals, is just thinking about it and thinking about its application. See, stainless steel is going to be used somewhere where they can't have it rust, but it needs to be really strong. So with that in mind, if it's not copper or brass and it's too heavy to be aluminum, it's probably stainless. If it's been sitting out for a while, you can also just look for rust spots on it because it won't have any. Now, I used to just ignore the stuff because I couldn't find a yard that would give me a decent price, but once I found one, now I definitely stack it up, because the thing is, it's worth about the same amount as aluminum, weight-wise, but it's a lot heavier, so it adds up really quick. Definitely don't pass it up. Now, the two other exotics, one would be a catalytic converter. I don't have any right now, I sold all of mine, but they contain platinum, palladium, and rhodium? It depends on who made them and how old they are as to what they're worth, but they go anywhere from like a little bit to a whole bunch. So I'll put a couple pictures over here, and if you see the honeycomb pattern on the inside of where the exhaust flows through, that's where all the magic happens. That's where the good stuff is. So you'll know it when you see it. Don't leave them lying around your yard, or they will walk away. Last one I wanted to mention, you're probably not going to find any of these, but carbide tip drills. These things. They're used in mining. That's mostly steel, but the valuable part are these little nubbins on there. That's carbide, and it's worth about $10 a pound. And these things are covered in it. Now that is not something most people run across in their day-to-day lives, but there you go. That's pretty much it for the basics. I think the only metals you might find other than that are magnesium and nickel, but you probably won't find those. Even in nickels. They're actually mostly made out of zinc. And if I might be so bold as to make a suggestion, maybe don't scrap air conditioners, refrigerators, and water coolers, because you only get $4 to $8 in total out of any one of them. And I don't think it's worth releasing all that Freon into the atmosphere and degrading the ozone layer. That's just my opinion. That's why I stopped scrapping them. There are professionals out there who can reclaim the Freon gas and reuse it, and it's actually a valuable resource, but the one that I knew lost his job, and I don't know where to find another one. So now if anybody watching this has any suggestions, please add it to the comments down below, because I know there's stuff I left out, and this sort of industry is different in different regions. Otherwise, definitely read the comments, because that's where some of the best information is. I don't know everything, but I learn a lot from the other people who are watching this channel. Oh, while you're here, let's talk about stripping wire. I got a piece. I'll show you how I do it. Alright, so dead simple. Just a big knife. Slice an edge off like that, so you got something to work with. Hold it facing the other way. Get the knife into the edge that you just cut off. This definitely works better when it's straight. Hold it on an extreme angle so that the blade itself is just touching the copper. And then you can kind of just pull it through. And just peel that off. Not so bad, really. It's a lot better with a sharp knife. Now I only do that with stuff that's generally thicker than a pencil. This gauge right here, this is definitely worth the time it takes to strip it, but if you were gonna do that, I would suggest a wire stripper. Ubrism81 picked up a wire stripper that he seems really happy with, so I'll put a link to that as well as the video. Actually, check out the description, because I'll put a link to some of the tools that I mentioned and any relevant video. I've done a couple in the past, and then you might want to check out Ubrism's wire stripping one. So more information in the description and down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video and you think someone else will get some value out of it, then please click the like button, because otherwise it disappears into the abyss. That's how this works. Either way, happy scrapping, and whatever you're scrapping, leave it better than you found it. Keep doing the thing.